Can I give you a thumbs up?
Hi everyone, this is Anil from Toppr. I'm a subject matter expert in biology, and the topic for today is physiology of digestion. Okay, so that's the topic for today. So we'll start with a few basic questions. The first one is, why do we need food? Okay, why do we need food? Then, what is the need for digestion? Okay, what's the need for digestion? A third one. Once we discuss these two things, then we'll move on to an overview of the path taken by the ingested food. So the food that we eat, okay, so what is the path it is actually taking? Okay, that's what we'll see next. And then finally we'll look at the digestion of the ingested food. Ingested is the food that we take through our mouth or consume. So digestion of the ingested food and its absorption. Okay, so these are the four things that we'll be covering today. Of course, these two are the most important parts, and these two, just to know why the entire digestion process is important. Okay, so first we'll start with the first question: why do we need food? Right now, if we take food, we need food because food contains nutrients. Food contains nutrients. Now, the question is, why do we need nutrients? Okay, so we need nutrients because nutrients are the ones which actually provide energy. Okay, so now, why do we need energy? Okay, sorry about that, there was a bit of lag. So why do we need energy? Like I said, food contains nutrients and nutrients provide energy. But why do we need energy? We need energy for activities. Okay, so when we say activities, it can be breathing. Okay, we know that without breathing we can't live. Heart pumping, okay, our heart functioning. Okay, even if you are sitting idle, okay, without doing any work, okay, you still need energy because these processes should happen. Not just that, every cell in your body should remain alive, and for that energy is required. So you need energy for activities. Of course, you need energy for growth, and if some injury happens, you need energy for repair, and you also need energy for protecting your body against infections, which we say immunity. तो इन सारे चीज़ों के लिए हमें एनर्जी की ज़रूरत है. तो फूड में न्यूट्रिएंट्स होती है और न्यूट्रिएंट्स एनर्जी प्रोवाइड करती है, और एनर्जी किस लिए चाहिए? इन चारों चीज़ों के लिए एनर्जी चाहिए. Okay, so that's all fine, but what are nutrients now? Okay, so what are nutrients? So if we take nutrients, nutrients can be broadly classified into two: macronutrients and then micronutrients. Okay, so nutrients दो तरीके का है, macro और micro. Those which are required in large amounts, okay, those which we need in large amounts, we call them macronutrients, and those which we need in little amounts or trace amounts, we call them the micronutrients. Now let's see what the macronutrients are. Okay, what the macronutrients are. The macronutrients are the carbohydrates, the proteins, and the lipids, or common word is fats. Okay, so these are the macronutrients. You need them in larger amounts, okay, in order to survive. Then we have micronutrients. Like I said, these are required only in small amounts. They are equally important, but these are required only in small amounts. So those include minerals and vitamins. Now, why are minerals and vitamins important? Okay, we'll deal with that in a different topic, but just for you to understand, minerals, for instance, take calcium or iron. You need calcium for your bone growth. You need iron for your hemoglobin, which is the one which transports the oxygen to various cells in our body. Hemoglobin basically has, it's an iron containing protein. Then you need vitamins for several metabolic reactions, which we will discuss later. So for now, we'll see how these three, carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids, provide energy. We are taking them in order to get energy. How these three are actually providing energy, that is what we'll see here. But before going to that, we'll discuss the next important aspect. Of course, yeah, in addition to these, okay, in addition to these, you can say water is also a very important thing which is required along with the three macronutrients. Now, the next thing is, what is the need for digestion, or why digestion is necessary? Okay, why do you need digestion? Okay, so I'll give you a simple example. So if you take, let's say you eat rice, okay, if you take a rice particle, okay, a boiled rice, okay, it will be close to, let's say, 1 centimeter. I'm just taking approximate value, 1 centimeter, which is around 1000 microns. Okay, now now if you take a cell, okay, if you take a cell, the cell is anywhere between an average human cell is around 0.1 millimeter. So just to give you a perspective, so if your rice particle is like this, your cell is like this. Okay, in fact much smaller than this. It's not to the scale, but so you can't expect this large or big rice particle to enter your cell and provide energy. Okay, so this rice particle has to be broken down. इतना बड़ा राइस पार्टिकल सेल के अंदर घुस नहीं सकता है. ओके, तो ये राइस पार्टिकल हमको we have to break it. Okay, that is essentially what happens in your digestion. This rice particle, which is nothing but carbohydrate, is broken down to simple particles. So इतना बड़ा पार्टिकल जो है, इसको ऐसे छोटे छोटे पार्टिकल्स में डाइजेशन के थ्रू ब्रेक किया जाएगा, जो सेल के अंदर आराम से जा सकता है. Okay, so this is what happens. So that is why digestion is necessary. Without digestion, not just rice, whatever you eat, the particle will be too big to enter the cell. Okay, so it has to be broken down into simpler particles so that they can be absorbed into the cell. They can actually enter the cell and provide the energy which is required for the body. Okay, so if you talk about the food that we take, the food essentially contains carbohydrates. Okay, what am I talking about? I'm talking about how these complex molecules are converted into simpler molecules. We'll see what the complex molecules are and what the simpler molecules are. So you have carbohydrates, you have proteins, and then you have lipids, or the common term is fats. Okay, पहले carbohydrates को लेते हैं. If you look at the carbohydrates, okay, so the common carbohydrates, let's say you're eating a chapati, okay, or rice, just take common things. What they have is starch. Okay, what they have is starch. Starch is nothing but a polysaccharide. Okay, saccharide means sugar. Okay, and poly means many. Okay, so basically starch is nothing but several sugar molecules joined together. Okay, poly, many sugar molecules are attached with each other. So this is a big molecule, okay, which has to be broken down into simpler molecules, single units. Okay, a big molecule should be broken down to single units. Now this polysaccharide is broken down to monosaccharides. Okay, so in other words, many monosaccharides combine together to form polysaccharides. Since our cells cannot take the polysaccharide directly, they have to be broken down into monosaccharides before they can be absorbed into the cells. Okay, so this is what happens in your digestion. Okay, this is what happens to the carbohydrates. Now let's take the proteins. Let's see what happens to the proteins. Okay, just like carbohydrates, the proteins are also, okay, another word for proteins is polypeptides. Okay, which is a combination of several peptides. Now, a protein is actually formed by amino acids. So several amino acids, this is an amino acid, this is an amino acid. Several amino acids are linked together to form a big chain, okay, to form a big chain which we call a polypeptide or a protein. Okay, a polypeptide or a protein. Now, usually when the number of amino acids is less than 20, okay, when the number of amino acids in a chain is less than 20, we call it a peptide. Okay, now if the number of amino acids is just 2, okay, the number of amino acids is just 2, we call it a dipeptide, because this bond which is actually holding the two amino acids together is the peptide bond. Okay, you don't have to know about it now, but definitely you'll have to know about it much later. Okay, so for now just understand this. The bond which is holding the amino acids together is the peptide bond. That is the reason why we are calling a protein which is made up of several amino acids linked together with a peptide bond a polypeptide. Okay, if the number of amino acids is less than 20, we call it a peptide. Okay, and then if it is just 2, we call it a dipeptide. Now if the amino acids are 3, okay, if the amino acids are 3, we call it a tripeptide. Okay, so the proteins which are complex molecules multiplied, let's say this is 500 to 1000. Okay, so you have 500 to, you have big molecules like this, 500 to 1000. This is a big molecule. This cannot directly enter our cell, so this has to be broken down to polypeptides. Even the peptides cannot enter, so they have to be broken down to either dipeptides or tripeptides, which are ultimately broken down to single units, which we call amino acids. So in other words, protein should be broken down to either amino acids or dipeptides and tripeptides, and this happens in the digestion process. Okay, this is what happens to the proteins before they can be absorbed into a cell. Okay. Now what about the lipids or fats? What about the lipids or fats? Okay, fat, another term for fat is triglyceride. Another name for fat or lipid is triglyceride. Now why do we call it triglyceride? Because the basic structure is something like this. It has a glycerol. Okay, it has a glycerol molecule, and to this glycerol molecule 3 fatty acids are attached. Okay, fatty acid 1, fatty acid 2, fatty acid 3. So you have, this is your fat. When we talk about fat, this is its structure. It has a glycerol molecule to which 3 fatty acids are attached. Okay, now in this triglyceride, if you take out one fatty acid, this is called a diglyceride. Okay, when the triglyceride loses one fatty acid, this, if you break this bond and remove one fatty acid, we call it a diglyceride. Okay, if we remove another fatty acid, then, okay, if you remove even this, then what we get is a monoglyceride. Then finally, if you break even this bond, then what we get is glycerol plus fatty acids. That means the monoglycerides will give a glycerol molecule and a fatty acid. Okay, so the fats are nothing but triglycerides. By removing one fatty acid, we get diglycerides. By removing 2 fatty acids, we get monoglyceride, and the monoglyceride, upon breaking that final single bond, okay, we get glycerol plus fatty acid. Okay, so when the lipids are digested, this is what we get. If they are completely broken down, this is what we get, glycerol and fatty acids. And these are the things which are simpler molecules which can be absorbed directly into the system, directly into the cell. Okay, so just to summarize, okay, and this is kind of important, just to summarize. So for the carbohydrates to be absorbed, they have to be broken down to monosaccharides. Okay, right. Then for the proteins to be absorbed, they have to be broken down to the simpler units, which are amino acids. Okay, amino acids, or we can even call, sometimes even the dipeptides and tripeptides can also be taken inside the cell. So the protein should be broken down to dipeptides, tripeptides, and or amino acids. Amino acids are the simplest ones. So if you have to represent it this way, amino acid is this, dipeptide is this, tripeptide is this. Okay, so any of these forms can be absorbed, can enter the cell. Okay, then lipids. For the lipids, it has to be either a monoglyceride, okay, or fatty acid plus glycerol. Okay, so these are the things. So whatever food we take, they have to be broken down to these components before they can be absorbed, and that is what will happen in the digestion. Okay, so like I said, the carbohydrates have to be broken down into monosaccharides, right? And the proteins have to be broken into either amino acids, dipeptides or tripeptides, and the lipids have to be broken either down to monoglycerides or into fatty acids plus glycerol. Okay, let's see how these events actually occur in the digestion process. Okay, so we'll first look at the overview we'll look at the overview of the path taken by the ingested food. Okay, whatever food we take through our mouth, okay, how is it actually moving through the alimentary canal? Okay, so that is what we'll see now. Okay, so when you take the food through the mouth, okay, the food first enters the mouth, or you can call it oral cavity. Okay, the food first enters here. Now in the mouth, you know, let's say we have three important components. The teeth, as far as digestion is concerned, you have teeth, tongue, and of course you have your saliva, okay, which is produced by your salivary glands. Okay, so salivary glands. Now these two, okay, the teeth and the tongue help in mastication of the food. ये दो mastication of food में help करता है. Now what is mastication? Basically the chewing process, okay, the chewing process, जब हम चबाते हैं तब teeth की वजह से, okay, the food is mechanically broken down, okay, mechanically broken down to simpler particles. Okay, so whatever we eat, okay, teeth के action की वजह से, okay, वो छोटे छोटे pieces में break किया जाता है. Okay, so these two actually help in the mastication process. Now the saliva, okay, the saliva has two important functions. Okay, so the saliva which is released in the mouth has two important functions. One is formation of bolus. Bolus. Okay, so teeth की वजह से जो particles, okay, जो अभी break होके छोटे छोटे particles बन गए हैं, बड़े particles अभी जो छोटे छोटे particles बन गए हैं, okay, वो छोटे छोटे particles को, okay, the saliva actually holds them together, okay, holds them together, okay, adheres them together, joins them together to form, okay, something called bolus, which is nothing but a mass. Okay, so all the particles are joined together to form a mass, a ball, okay, ball of food, ball of broken food, which we call bolus. Okay, ये bolus form करना एक saliva का function है. दूसरा, lubrication of food. Okay, lubrication of the food. वो जो food अभी smoothly अंदर जाने के लिए, okay, saliva एक lubricant जैसा काम करता है. Okay, so that easily food next part of the alimentary canal जा सके. Okay, so in addition to these two functions, okay, in addition to these two functions, we all know that saliva actually has two things. The saliva has an amylase, which we call the salivary amylase, and it also has lysozyme. Okay, तो food mouth के अंदर पूरा सलेवे के साथ मिक्स किया जाता है. Okay, मिक्स होके bolus बन जाता है. Okay, that's the first part. The teeth and the tongue help in the mastication of the food. Okay, the saliva makes a bolus out of the particles, okay, which are formed by the mechanical breakdown of the food. Okay, तो इनके अलावा saliva में दो enzymes है, amylase और lysozyme. Lysozyme जो है, okay, lysozyme is an enzyme which actually acts on bacteria. तो हम जो खाना लेते हैं उसमें जो भी बैक्टीरिया है उसको, okay, in order to kill them, okay, उसको मारने के लिए लाइसोसोम काम आती है. Then amylase, we'll see what amylase does, okay, when we talk about digestion of carbohydrates. So this is what happens in the mouth. तो फूड माउथ में एंटर होने के बाद टीथ और टंग की एक्शन की वजह से छोटे छोटे पीसेस में ब्रेक किया जाता है. वो छोटे छोटे पीसेस सलाइवा की वजह से पूरा बाइंड होके एक बोलस बनता है. ओके, ये बोलस नेक्स्ट पार्ट में चला जाता है, which is so we have the bolus formation here. Now the bolus actually moves into the next part, which is your pharynx. Okay, now from the pharynx, the food will start to move down. Okay, so this is your esophagus. Okay, the bolus from here will start to move down through the esophagus. Okay, so here if you look at the next parts, which are the pharynx and esophagus, this is what happens here. Okay, the bolus which is formed and which is now sitting in the mouth, okay, bolus from mouth will start moving and enter the pharynx. Okay, will start moving and enter the pharynx. Now from the pharynx, through a process called deglutition, okay, deglutition, which is nothing but process of swallowing. Okay, simple word is process of swallowing. Okay, process of swallowing. So through the process of swallowing from the pharynx, तो यहाँ से swallowing की वजह से esophagus enter हो जाता है. Okay, through the process of swallowing enters the esophagus. So this is kind of an important word, deglutition. Okay, just have to remember deglutition. The bolus enters the pharynx, and from the pharynx, through the process of deglutition, okay, enters the esophagus, and in the esophagus or the esophagus, okay, however you want to pronounce it, okay, from the esophagus, through the peristaltic movement, okay, enters or reaches the gastroesophageal sphincter. Okay, now I told you in the first class that before the esophagus actually opens into the stomach, somewhere in this region you have a muscle, okay, which is usually closed. Okay, which is usually closed. This band of muscles, which we call the esophageal sphincter, actually controls, okay, this by sitting here actually controls the entry of food coming from the esophagus. Okay, so this has to open before the food can actually enter the stomach. So food agar stomach mein enter hona hai, to it has to cross through the gastroesophageal sphincter. Okay, so peristaltic movement. Now what do we mean by peristaltic movement? Now if you look at let me show you peristaltic movement. So let's say okay, the simple example is your toothpaste. Okay, so what do you do if your toothpaste is, let's say, somewhere here? Okay, what do you do? And the mouth is somewhere here. Okay, so you start pressing from here. So you press here so that this moves one step ahead. Okay, then you press here, then it moves one step ahead, then you press here, finally it moves. So this is peristaltic movement. So the muscle contraction happens, the first muscle contraction happens here, the muscle contracts here, okay, pushes the foot forward, then the muscle contraction happens here, pushes the foot a little bit forward. Okay, so this continues. So this is peristaltic movement. Okay, so the contractions keep happening until the food actually reaches the so here you can see here, so this is your peristaltic movement. Okay, so you can see the contraction happening here. This is your bolus. Okay, this is your bolus. The contraction happening, pushing the foot forward. Okay, now the foot actually moved one step forward. Now the contraction happens Earlier it was happening here. Now the contraction happens one step ahead so that it pushes the bolus further in the forward direction. Okay, so this happens, this peristaltic movement happens until the food actually reaches the gastroesophageal sphincter, and from the gastroesophageal sphincter it then enters the stomach. So what have we seen so far? In the mouth, bolus was formed, and bolus through the swallowing process, okay, entered the esophagus, and from the esophagus through the peristaltic movement entered the stomach. Now the food is actually in the stomach. Now let's see what are the events that actually happen in the stomach. Now if you look at the events that actually happen in the stomach, the bolus or food, whatever you want to call it, food or bolus, is actually stored for 4 to 5 hours. Okay, the food or bolus is actually stored for 4 to 5 hours. Now in this 4 to 5 hours, what happens? I told you already that the stomach has gastric glands. Okay, the innermost layer of the stomach, which we call the mucosa, okay, the mucosa of the stomach has the gastric glands. So these gastric glands actually secrete or release gastric juice. Okay, these gastric glands actually release gastric juice. Okay, now if you remember, just to refresh your memory, the gastric glands mainly contain two types of cells. You have your peptic cells, okay, then you have your parietal cells. Okay, now in some books you will actually see the other terms which are being used for these: chief cells, or these are also called as oxyntic cells. Okay, so you have in the gastric glands you have two important cells, 1 and 2. Two important cells. The peptic or the chief cells are the ones which actually secrete two enzymes. Okay, these secrete two enzymes. One is pepsinogen. Okay, one is pepsinogen, which is an inactive form of an enzyme called pepsin. Okay, I'll tell you why it is actually released in this form. Okay, and the second one is the lipase. These are the two enzymes which actually are produced by this. Since this lipase is actually present in the gastric juice, we call it gastric lipase. We can even call it gastric lipase. And then we have the oxyntic cells, which also produce, oxyntic are the parietal cells, which also produce two things. One is HCl, okay, the hydrochloric acid, and then you have intrinsic factor. Okay, this intrinsic factor, which is released by the oxyntic cells or the parietal cells, is required for the absorption of vitamin B1. Vitamin B1 food से absorb करने के लिए ये intrinsic factor हमें चाहिए. Okay, without intrinsic factor, you cannot absorb the vitamin B1 in the food. Okay, sorry, yeah. I'm sorry, this is vitamin B12. Okay, vitamin B12 from the food. Okay, so yeah, so now what is happening? The food which is stored in the stomach for 4 to 5 hours, it is getting mixed with the gastric juice. It is getting completely mixed with the gastric juice. So at this stage you have gastric juice plus bolus. Okay, so in the stomach you have the gastric juice plus bolus. Now this gastric juice plus bolus, or the food, whatever you want to call it, okay, these are, okay, mixed thoroughly. Okay, mixed thoroughly by the churning movements of the stomach. Okay, so if you listen carefully, okay, after having a good meal, you can actually listen your stomach making sounds. Okay, so that is because the stomach is churning. It has several movements. Okay, and these movements will mix the gastric juice and bolus. Not only mix these two, okay, it also mechanically breaks the food. Okay, so whatever, so you have the particle. Let's say this is the big particle, which is now broken down to this size. Now, because of the stomach action, this is further broken down to this size. Okay, so this is because of the teeth and the other mastication process, and this is because of the churning movements of the stomach. So finally, what you have is a gastric juice mixed with bolus, which is now being churned by the stomach muscles. Finally, what you have is called chyme. So this chyme is nothing but further smaller particles of the food plus gastric juice. So this chyme, since gastric juice has lots and lots of HCl, this chyme is highly acidic. Okay, the chyme in the stomach is highly acidic because it is mixed with the HCl coming from the gastric juice released by the gastric glands of the stomach. Okay, so we started with bolus. The bolus started moving through the pharynx and the esophagus. Okay, through the esophageal sphincter, it entered the stomach. In the stomach, it got mixed with the gastric juice, okay, to finally form the chyme. Okay, now you have chyme in the stomach. Okay, you have chyme in the stomach. Now, the next part, the chyme which is there in the stomach, okay, the chyme which is there in the stomach will now enter the first part of the small intestine. Okay, the first part of the small intestine. What is the first part of the small intestine? So if you remember, okay, if you remember, so this is your stomach, and the stomach is actually entering the first part. So here the stomach is opening into the first part of the, so this is the opening of the stomach into the first part of the small intestine, which we call the duodenum. Okay, the first part of the small intestine. So the chyme now enters the first part of the small intestine, which we call the duodenum. Okay, again, in the duodenum, you have several mechanical movements, just like your stomach. Okay, even the duodenum has several muscle movements, because of which further breakdown of the particles will happen. Okay, now in the duodenum, in addition to the movements, you have bile, pancreatic juice, and the intestinal juice. Okay, so in the duodenum, the chyme which is now coming from the stomach is mixed with bile, pancreatic juice, and the intestinal juice. Okay, just understand this. So from the stomach, the food just entered the duodenum, and into the duodenum you have bile. And where is this bile coming from? This bile is coming from the liver plus gallbladder. Okay, this bile is coming from the liver plus gallbladder. Now where is this pancreatic juice coming from? Pancreatic juice is coming from the pancreas or the pancreas. Okay, and this intestinal juice, where is this coming from? This is coming from the intestinal glands. This is coming from the intestinal glands, which are actually present in the innermost layer of the intestine, the mucosa. Okay, so the duodenum itself. Okay, the duodenal inner layer is actually producing the intestinal juice. Okay, the intestinal glands present in the duodenum itself is producing the intestinal juice. Okay, so the chyme which is now entering from the stomach into the duodenum is mixed with bile, pancreatic juice, and the intestinal juice. So you can see here, okay, you can see here, okay, so you have coming from here, okay, then the food from here is actually entering the duodenum. Now if you see the connections here, so these are the various connections. So this is your duodenum. The stomach, this is actually attached to the stomach, which is not shown here. Okay, this is actually attached to the stomach. Okay, now you see the liver, okay, is, okay, you have the common hepatic duct, you have the gallbladder which actually stores the bile. Okay, so the bile which is stored in the gallbladder is actually moving through here. Okay, is actually moving through here. Yeah, is actually moving through here, and through the hepatopancreatic duct is actually opening directly into the small intestine. Okay, and in the same way, the pancreas are also opening through the same hepatopancreatic duct into the small intestine. So the liver and the gallbladder are releasing the bile juice here. The pancreas are releasing, okay, the pancreas are releasing the pancreatic juice here. And in addition to that, the intestinal wall itself is actually releasing the intestinal juice. So three things. So the food coming from the stomach, okay, the stomach is not shown here. It is actually attached to the duodenum. The food coming from here is mixed with the bile juice coming from the liver and the gallbladder, the pancreatic juice coming from the pancreas, and the intestinal juice being produced by the intestinal mucosa of the duodenum. Okay, the intestinal mucosa of the duodenum. So now we have the chyme in the duodenum part of the small intestine, which is being mixed with bile, pancreatic juice, and the intestinal juice. Okay, let me just give you what are the contents of bile here. Okay, if you take bile, bile has bile pigments. Okay, it has bile pigments. It has bile salts. Okay, then it has cholesterol, and of course it has phospholipids. Now, in addition to this, sometimes heavy metals are also present in the bile juice, which the liver is actually trying to excrete out of the body. Anyway, so these are the components which you will see in bile. Okay, then what do you have in pancreatic juice or pancreatic juice? In the pancreatic juice, if you look at the pancreatic juice, okay, the pancreatic juice has trypsinogen. Again, wherever you see ogen, it is a inactive enzyme. Okay, this is an inactive enzyme. Okay, then you have chymotrypsinogen. You have chymotrypsinogen. Again, you have another inactive enzyme, pro-carboxypeptidase. Okay, before the actual carboxypeptidase. Okay, so this is the actual form before the actual carboxypeptidase. Then you have amylases. Okay, you have amylases. Then you have lipases, and then you have nucleases. So these are the various things that you see in the pancreatic juice. You have trypsinogen, chymotrypsinogen, pro-carboxypeptidase, amylase, lipase, and the nucleases. Okay, so these are the things which are present in your pancreatic juice. Then the things which are present in the intestinal juice. What all do we have in the intestinal juice? In the intestinal juice, of course, forgot to mention, in the pancreatic juice, in addition to these, okay, you have lots and lots of bicarbonates. I'll tell you why this is important. Okay, the pancreatic juice, in addition to these, have bicarbonates. Okay, bicarbonates. Now let's move on to the intestinal juice. Intestinal juice has disaccharidases. Okay, then dipeptidases, lipases, and then nucleosidases. Okay, nucleosidases. Right? So these are the various things which are actually present in your intestinal juice. Okay, so the chyme which is now in the duodenum of the small intestine is now being mixed with bile, pancreatic juice, okay, pancreatic juice, and the intestinal juice. And I already told you what are the various components that bile has, pancreatic juice has, and intestinal juice has. Okay, so majority of the digestion, okay, majority of the digestion occurs in small intestine, specifically duodenum of the small intestine. Okay, duodenum of the small intestine is where majority of the digestion or breaking down of the complex particles into simpler particles happen. Majority, okay, maximum amount of digestion actually happens here in the duodenum. Okay, I'll tell you what are the various things that actually happen here. So once the digestion is done, the food from the duodenum, okay, the digested food from the duodenum then enters the next parts, which are the jejunum and ileum. Okay, the food then enters the jejunum and the ileum. Okay, these two are parts of your small intestine itself. Okay, these two are parts of small intestine itself. So here in these two parts, maximum absorption happens. So whatever food was digested in the duodenum, okay, now the complex particles, the bigger particles, are now broken down into simpler particles. Okay, that happens completely in the duodenum. Okay, these simpler particles are then absorbed in the sense they are actually taken into the cell. Okay, they are taken into the cell. These are again intestinal cells. Okay, particularly of the region jejunum and ileum. Okay, so these particles, which are smaller particles, are now taken inside the cell. Okay, this is what we call the absorption, taking up of simpler particles into the cell and then into the body. Okay, so the maximum absorption actually happens in this region. Okay, then the food moves from the jejunum and ileum through the ileocecal wall Okay, this is the valve. This is the wall which is present between the small intestine and the large intestine. Okay, through the ileocecal wall will then enter the large intestine. In the large intestine, what you have to remember is, in the large intestine, no digestion occurs. Okay, no digestion occurs in the large intestine. Okay, the only thing that happens is absorption. Now, what is being absorbed in the large intestine? Only water, okay, some minerals and some drugs. Okay, some drugs. These are the things which are actually absorbed in the large intestine. Okay, towards the end of the large intestine, you have your rectum. So, and of course, after absorbing these, the large intestine also does one more thing. It releases mucus. Okay, the large intestine actually releases mucus. This mucus is what holds the unabsorbed particles together. So whatever things are not absorbed into the system, okay, those particles are joined together to form, okay, to form your feces. Okay, to form your feces. Okay, to form your feces. Okay, so in the rectum, the feces is actually stored for a few hours before it is actually released through the anus. Okay, so this is what happens in the, if you look at the various things that actually occur, this is what happens to the food. So in the stomach, sorry, in the mouth, you see the formation of bolus. Okay, the food is getting actually mixed with the saliva to form bolus. Okay, the bolus is moving through the pharynx into the esophagus, and from the esophagus through deglutition moving to the stomach. Okay, in the stomach it is getting mixed with the gastric juice. It is getting mixed with the gastric juice released by the gastric glands of the stomach mucosa to form the chyme, okay, this chyme is then moving to the duodenum of the small intestine, where it is getting mixed with bile, pancreatic juice and the intestinal juice. Okay, this is where the maximum digestion happens. Once the digestion happens, this food then moves into the other parts of the small intestine, the jejunum and the ileum, where the digested particles are actually absorbed. Once the absorption happens, once the main particles, the important nutrients are absorbed in the ileum and the jejunum and the ileum part of the small intestine, the food then enters through the ileocecal valve into the large intestine. In the large intestine, some amount of water and minerals and some drugs are absorbed, and lots of mucus is released. This mucus will actually hold the unabsorbed particle together, and this is what we call the feces, which then moves to the rectum, where it is stored for some time before it is actually released through the anus. Okay, so this is what happens to the food that we eat. Now, moving on to the next part, what is happening to the individual components. So we look at carbohydrate digestion and absorption. Okay, we'll look at the carbohydrate digestion and absorption. Now, in the mouth, we'll start with the mouth. Okay, in the mouth, you see the release of salivary amylase. Okay, this is salivary amylase. Okay, this salivary amylase will convert, your starch, which is nothing but like I said in the beginning, it's a polysaccharide. Okay, so many sugars. Okay, many sugars. So this polysaccharide is acted upon by the salivary amylase in the mouth. This is happening in the mouth. Okay, acted upon to form, this is two sugar molecule, okay, which is called a 2 sugar molecule is called a disaccharide. Okay, 2 sugars. Saccharide is sugar, like I said in the beginning. Di is 2. So a 2 sugar molecule called maltose. Plus, again, the food is in the mouth only for a short period of time. So the digestion of the starch in the mouth or in the oral cavity, or while it passes through the pharynx and the esophageal tract or esophageal tube, is very less. So the exposure is very less. So here only a small amount of digestion will happen, only a small amount of maltose is formed. The rest all will be in the form of either oligosaccharides, which is, oligo is few. Okay, oligo means few. Okay, so here, so few will be there, or it will remain as polysaccharide. Okay, so basically what you have after the food, after the carbohydrates enter the stomach, enter the oral cavity, is you have maltose, then you have oligosaccharides. Okay, let me write it down here. Oligosaccharides, or if polysaccharides. So this is what is entering to the stomach. Okay, a mixture of maltose. So we're talking about the carbohydrates. We're not talking about the proteins or the lipids. We're talking about the carbohydrates. Okay, so the things that enter the stomach would be small amount of maltose, along with that oligosaccharides and polysaccharides. Okay, now in the stomach, okay, so as far as carbohydrate digestion is concerned, no carbohydrate digestion actually happens in the stomach. Okay, however, you have concentrated HCl which is released. This concentrated HCl through chemical process might break down the polysaccharides, okay, into oligosaccharides, simple sugars. Okay, simpler, not simplest, but somewhat simpler than the polysaccharide. Okay, so usually nothing happens in the stomach. Now this mixture of polysaccharide plus oligosaccharide plus maltose will then from the stomach will then enter the duodenum. Will now enter the duodenum. Okay, will now enter the duodenum. In the duodenum, you see the release of, I told you in the duodenum, it is getting mixed with bile, pancreatic juice, and the intestinal juice. It is getting mixed with all the three. Okay, it's getting mixed with all the three. Now, if you look at the pancreatic juice, I told you pancreatic juice has, one of the things that it has is amylase. So since this is an amylase which is present in the pancreatic juice, we call it pancreatic amylase. Okay, so this pancreatic amylase again acts upon polysaccharides or the oligosaccharides. Okay, it then acts on the oligosaccharides or the polysaccharides. Okay, this is amylase from the pancreas, and this is happening in the duodenum. Okay, because pancreatic juice is actually released into the duodenum of the small intestine. In the presence of amylase, it is converted into disaccharides. Okay, so many such things. Okay, so this can be a polysaccharide. Okay, this can be an oligo. Whatever it is converted to 2-unit sugar moiety. Okay, called 2-sugar moiety containing disaccharide. Okay, now these disaccharides which are in the duodenum, okay, these disaccharides, okay, these disaccharides are then broken down by disaccharidases. Okay, these are then broken down by the disaccharidases. Okay, so these are then broken down by the disaccharidases to form monosaccharides. Okay, so 2 units are now being broken down to single unit sugars which can be absorbed by the intestinal cells. Okay, which can be absorbed by the intestinal cells. Right? So this is how complex carbohydrates are being converted into simpler monosaccharides, okay, by the first salivary amylase, then the pancreatic amylase, then the disaccharidases which are actually present in the intestinal juice. Okay, the intestinal juice actually contains the disaccharidases. Okay, in fact, specifically these disaccharidases, if you look at the intestine, I told you the intestine has cells with several, these are villi. Okay, so brush border cells, these are called brush border cells. Okay, so here in this brush border, okay, you actually have the, in this brush border, you actually have the disaccharidases. Okay, so these disaccharidases, for instance, you have the disaccharidases can be maltase, okay, sucrase. Suppose you ate sugar, okay, okay, then obviously your food will, your intestine will be having sucrose. Okay, then let's say you drank milk, then you have lactose. So whatever it is, okay, if it is rice or chapati that you ate, okay, that will have starch, the starch is broken down to maltose, and the maltose, okay, this happens in the presence of amylase. Okay, now the maltose is converted to glucose plus glucose in the presence of maltase, which is a disaccharidase. Disaccharidase is a common term. So all those which can actually break down 2 two sugar moiety containing molecules into single sugar moiety containing molecules are called disaccharidases. Okay, disaccharidases. Then in the same way, if you take milk, it will have lactose, which is a disaccharide, which is then broken down by lactase to form glucose and galactose. Okay, then if you take sugar with your milk, then obviously it will have sucrose, which is then broken down by sucrase to form glucose plus fructose. Okay, now all these monosaccharides, whether it is glucose, galactose or fructose, okay, whether it is glucose, galactose or fructose, are now in the small intestine. Okay, so these are small molecules which can be directly absorbed into the small intestine cells. Okay, cells of the small intestine. So this absorption, okay, we'll deal with the absorption in the next class. Okay, so the absorption actually happens. Okay, I'll tell you in detail how the absorption actually happens. Okay, for now, absorption can happen by three different ways. Okay, by the passive way or the facilitated way. It's called facilitated diffusion or facilitated transport, or the active way. Okay, most of these sugars are transported through the facilitated diffusion. So you all have these sugars. These are then absorbed into the intestinal cells. So I told you that these are the intestinal cells. You have intestinal cells like this. So the sugars are now here. Okay, you have your glucose, you have your galactose, you have your fructose. All of them enter the intestinal cell. Okay, intestinal cell. These intestinal cells are actually connected to the blood vessels. Okay, so these intestinal cells are supplied with the blood vessels. So from here, the sugars then enter the blood vessels, and in the blood, through the blood, these are transported to the cells of the body. Okay, so each and every cell in the body will get glucose. Each and every cell in the body can now pick up the glucose. So this is what happens to carbohydrates. So the carbohydrates, in other words, polysaccharides, are first broken down by the action of salivary amylase into maltose and oligosaccharides. The mixture of maltose, oligosaccharides and the polysaccharides, which are not at all digested, will then enter the stomach. Okay, in the stomach, digestion of carbohydrates generally don't happen. Then from the stomach, these carbohydrates then enter the small intestine. In the small intestine, this is then mixed, the food is then mixed with the pancreatic juice, which contains the pancreatic amylase, which cleaves these oligosaccharides and polysaccharides into disaccharides. These are then acted upon by the disaccharidases, which are present in the brush border of the intestinal cells. Okay, and these cleave the disaccharides into monosaccharides, which can then be absorbed into the intestinal cells, and from the intestinal cells they enter the blood vessels, from where they are supplied to, the monosaccharides are supplied to various parts of the body. Okay, first I'll tell you, first they'll be picked up by the liver. Okay, that's a story which we'll discuss in the next session. Okay, let's see what happens to the proteins. Again, I won't be discussing the absorption part in this session. We'll discuss the absorption part in the next session. Okay, so though I'm writing here, we'll be discussing just the digestion part. Okay, so if you look at the digestion, in the mouth you don't see any protein digestion. Nothing happens to the proteins in the mouth. Okay, nothing happens to the proteins in the mouth. Now from the mouth, through the pharynx and the oesophagus, the food then enters the stomach. Okay, the food then enters the stomach. Now let's see what happens in the stomach. I told you in the stomach you're getting your HCl plus pepsinogen. Plus, of course, you have gastric lipase. Okay, so these are the things which are there in the stomach. Okay, now the HCl will provide acidic environment. Okay, the pH in the stomach will be around 1.8. Okay, in this acidic environment, okay, the pepsinogen, which was initially inactive, okay, this was inactive, is now getting converted to pepsin. Okay, the inactive pepsinogen is getting converted to pepsin. Okay, now what will the pepsin do? The pepsin here will act on proteins. Okay, the proteins in the presence of pepsin will be converted to small polypeptides. Okay, small polypeptides. Right? Small polypeptides. Now, these small polypeptides sometimes are also referred to as peptones. Okay, protein is basically a polypeptide, big polypeptide you can say. Okay, these are broken down into small polypeptides by the action of pepsin. Okay, so you're getting small polypeptides. Sometimes they are referred to as peptones or proteases as well. Proteoses. Oh, okay, proteoses. Okay, so these small polypeptides. So with the action of pepsin, the bigger polypeptides are being broken down to smaller peptides, and this is happening in the stomach. Okay, so initially this is being released as inactive pepsinogen, okay, which is then getting activated to form pepsin in the presence of, so the activation requires HCl. Okay, so if the pepsin is released in the active form, it is important to understand that the pepsinogen is released only when you have food in the stomach. Okay, only when you have food in the stomach. Okay, so only then the pepsinogen will be released. What happens if it is released even when there is no food? Okay, since our stomach muscles are also made up of protein, there's a good chance that it can actually chew up our own stomach. Okay, it can start acting and chewing up our own stomach. So that's the reason why it is actually released in the inactive form. It gets activated only in the presence of HCl. Okay, in the presence of HCl, the pepsinogen will now become active pepsin, which can now act on the protein in the food, convert the polypeptides or the protein in the food into smaller polypeptides, which we call the peptones or the proteoses. Okay, so now in the stomach we have small polypeptides. Okay, now these small polypeptides, okay, are now entering the duodenum. I told you the first part of the small intestine is where they enter. Okay, so are entering the duodenum, and I told you before that the duodenum is actually getting pancreatic juice, okay, bile, pancreatic juice, as well as the intestinal juice. Right? Now, if you remember, I told you that the intestinal juice, okay, the pancreatic juice has several enzymes: trypsinogen, chymotrypsinogen, right? Then you have procarboxypeptidase, okay. So as far as proteins are concerned, these are the three enzymes which actually act on proteins. Okay, rest of them will act on the other things. Okay, like your amylase will act on the starch, which we already discussed. Then we'll talk about the other components when we get there. Okay, when we talk about the lipids. So these are the various things. Yeah, these are various things which are actually present in the pancreatic juice. Now, the trypsinogen and the chymotrypsinogen, as I told you before, these are inactive, including the procarboxypeptidase. Okay, these are all inactive. Okay, so here an enzyme called enterokinase. Okay, an enzyme called enterokinase, which is actually present in the intestinal juice. Okay, the intestinal juice actually has an enzyme called enterokinase. Okay, the intestinal juice has enterokinase. This enterokinase, okay, this enterokinase converts your trypsinogen into trypsin, the active form, which is your trypsin. Okay, the enterokinase is converting your trypsinogen into trypsin. Now the trypsin which is now activated, will then convert chymotrypsinogen, okay, into chymotrypsin. Okay, the trypsin which is now activated will convert chymotrypsinogen, which is the inactive form, into chymotrypsin. The carboxypeptidase is also activated. Okay, finally you have all the three in the active form, okay, in the duodenum. Okay, now what do they do? Once they get activated, these convert, whether it is proteins, okay, or peptones or proteoses, it doesn't matter, okay, which are nothing but your small polypeptides. So all these small polypeptides are then converted into, okay, in the presence of trypsin, chymotrypsin, and the carboxypeptidase. Okay, in the presence of all these three, they are converted into dipeptide. Okay, the proteins and the small polypeptides are now converted into dipeptides. So if I have to show this, you can imagine something like this. This big chain, okay, this big chain and a fewer amino acid containing chain is now converted into 2 amino acid containing chain. So this is 1 amino acid and this is another amino acid. So 2 amino acid containing chain. So bigger chains are now broken to form a 2 amino acid containing chain, which we call the dipeptide. Okay, dipeptide. Now in the intestine, again, the brush border of the intestinal cells again have dipeptidases. Okay, dipeptidases, which now converts the dipeptides into amino acids. Okay, the dipeptidases then convert the dipeptides into amino acids. So you started with proteins. Okay, nothing happened in the mouth. The proteins then moved to the stomach. In the stomach, pepsinogen was released. Okay, pepsinogen was released, which was then activated by HCl to pepsin. The pepsin then acted on proteins to form small polypeptides. These small polypeptides then entered the duodenum, where you have 3 components: trypsinogen, chymotrypsinogen, and carboxypeptidase. The trypsinogen, which was released in the inactive form, was then activated by the enterokinase of the intestinal juice. Okay, now you have trypsin. The trypsin then activates the chymotrypsinogen to form chymotrypsin. The trypsin, chymotrypsin, and the carboxypeptidase, all of them together act on the proteins and the small polypeptides that are coming from the stomach into the duodenum, convert them into dipeptides. These dipeptides are further broken down by the dipeptidases, which are present in the brush border of the intestinal epithelial cells, into amino acids. So finally you have your amino acids, and I told you in the beginning, the cells have the ability to take up dipeptides. Okay, it has the ability to take up the dipeptides, amino acids, as well as the tripeptides. So in any of these forms, these molecules are small enough to be picked up by your intestinal epithelial cells. But if they pick up the dipeptides and the tripeptides, they will be first broken down inside the cell, converted into amino acids. Inside the cell they will be broken down. We'll talk about the absorption part later. So that is about the digestion of the proteins. Then we'll finally look at the digestion of lipids. Okay, or fats or I told you the triglycerides. So basically you have a glycerol backbone to which through 3 fatty acids are attached. Okay, now here if you look at this, you have nothing is happening in the mouth, then you have the gastric lipase which is there in the stomach. Nothing is happening in the mouth, but in the stomach you have the gastric lipase, okay, which can act on the fats or the triglycerides to form diglycerides, okay. And to some extent I told you that if you remove one fatty acid it becomes a diglyceride, and if you remove 2 fatty acids it becomes a monoglyceride, okay. Sometimes it chops off only 1 fatty acid, sometimes it chops off 2 fatty acids to form monoglycerides, okay, to form monoglycerides. So all this happens in the presence of lipases, okay. This is your gastric lipase which is there in the stomach, okay. Then this is to a lesser extent, okay. From the stomach the lipids, okay, then enter, okay, the lipids then enter the duodenum, okay. In the duodenum I told you, okay, there's release of again the same thing, bile juice, pancreatic juice and the intestinal juice. So it's getting mixed with all of the bile helps in the emulsification of fats. The bile helps in the emulsification of fat. The pancreatic juice has a lipase. Okay, the pancreatic juice has a lipase. I told you that the peptic cells, okay, has the ability to produce lipase. And you have the intestinal juice. In the intestinal juice, okay, so first we'll look at the emulsification part. Okay, first we'll look at the emulsification part. What is emulsification? Again, emulsification, okay, is not digestion of fats. Okay, the lipid molecules, you can imagine them to be big molecules. Okay, so oil droplets. Okay, lipids are nothing but oil droplets. So these oil droplets, okay, if the enzyme wants to act on its surface, okay, let's say without any gap, if the enzyme molecules are able to bind to it, let's say 100 molecules of enzyme can bind to it. Okay, 100 molecules of enzyme can actually bind to it. Okay, now what happens here is, this is not sufficient to break down the entire lipid molecule. Okay, so in order to break this, so it's like a big ball which needs to be chopped down. Okay, so first it needs to be chopped down. Okay, so it's not digestion actually. What happens here is, here the bile salts will actually bind to the bigger lipid molecule and break them into smaller. Okay, so these are bile salts. Okay, each one will take a piece of it. Each bile salt will take a piece of it, okay, to form many portions of the lipid molecule. So this is your bile and this is your lipid. So many smaller globules or lobules are formed. Okay, many smaller particles of this big lipid molecule is formed, which can now be acted upon by the lipase. So this basically breaking down a big lipid particle into, okay, lipid particle into smaller particles. There's no digestion involved. It's just tearing them apart. Okay, we're just tearing a bigger drop of lipid into many small drops. Okay, so that is achieved by the bile salts, and this process is what we call the emulsification. Once the emulsification is done, you have your the pancreatic lipase. Okay, the pancreatic lipase, once the bile salts, the pancreatic lipase will then convert your di or monoglycerides. Okay, convert your di or pancreatic lipase, convert your di or monoglycerides into fatty acids plus glycerol, okay, which can be directly absorbed into the blood, okay, which can, sorry, not blood, which can be directly absorbed into the intestinal cells. Okay, from the intestinal cells, since these are not water soluble, they cannot enter the blood. Okay, they have to enter the lymph. Okay, we will see the absorption part, what happens once they are now. So far what we discussed is how these molecules are broken down and how they enter the, in fact we haven't even discussed how they enter the intestinal cells. So we are saying they are broken down and then picked up by the intestinal cells. Next class what we'll see is how these the molecules which are now small enough are actually picked up by the intestinal cells, okay, and then transported to the various regions. Okay, so next session we'll be discussing about the absorption. So just to wrap up the lipids part, nothing is happening in the mouth. In the stomach, small or a little amount of digestion is actually happening, where the lipids or the triglycerides are converted into di and monoglycerides. Then from the stomach they're actually entering the duodenum, where it is getting mixed with the, where the food is actually getting mixed with the bile juice and the pancreatic lipase. The bile juice will act on it, okay, to form, to cause the emulsification, okay, which is basically breaking down the bigger drop of lipid or the oil droplet into many small oil droplets. Okay, so these small oil droplets are then acted upon by the pancreatic lipase, which convert them into di and monoglycerides and finally into fatty acids and glycerol, which are then taken up by the intestinal cells. Okay, so in addition to this, the food, okay, also contains, the food in addition to this also contains something called nucleic acids. Okay, we'll talk about the digestion and absorption of the nucleic acids when we talk about the absorption of the carbohydrates, proteins and lipids. Okay, so that's all for today. When we meet in the next session, we'll talk about the absorption of carbohydrates, proteins and lipids, along with the digestion and absorption of nucleic acids. Okay, and we'll also look at some of the disorders associated with the digestive system. Okay, so that's all for today. Thank you one and all. Don't forget to subscribe Toppr on Facebook, Instagram and on YouTube as well. Okay, so that's it.